The funniest thing about being underestimated is watching the person who laughed the hardest forget how to breathe when you walk back into their life. The conference room fell silent the moment I stepped through the glass doors. A dozen executives rose from their chairs with polished smiles, straightened their jackets, and greeted the company's new CEO with rehearsed enthusiasm. I barely noticed any of them. My attention stopped on one face at the far end of the table. Ryan Brooks. His coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. The color drained from his face so quickly it almost looked unreal. 6 years had passed since I'd seen him, yet I would have recognized those blue eyes anywhere. They had once looked at me like I was the center of his world. Then they had looked at me with disappointment. Finally, they had looked at me with amusement as he laughed at my dream in front of an entire room full of people. "You?" he whispered before he could stop himself. The room grew awkwardly quiet. Several department heads exchanged confused glances, clearly wondering why one of their senior project managers sounded like he'd seen a ghost. I offered him the same calm smile I'd practiced for countless business meetings over the years. "Good morning, everyone," I said, setting my leather portfolio on the table. "I'm Ethan Carter. I appreciate the warm welcome." Ryan never took his eyes off me. He looked exactly the way memories refuse to age. His dark brown hair was shorter now. His tailored navy suit fit perfectly. There were faint lines near his eyes that hadn't been there when we were 23, but they only made him look more real. Older. Tired. Human. The board chair cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter recently completed the acquisition of Ashford Dynamics and will personally oversee the restructuring process." Someone applauded politely. Others followed. Ryan didn't move. He simply stared as if the world had rewritten itself without asking his permission. I continued introducing myself, outlining goals, thanking the employees for their commitment, but my voice almost sounded distant inside my own head. Because while everyone else saw a successful executive standing confidently at the front of the room, all I could see was another night 6 years earlier. A tiny apartment. Cheap takeout growing cold on the kitchen counter. My laptop balanced on a stack of textbooks because I couldn't afford a proper desk. I had spent months building software that I believed could change everything. Ryan had listened patiently while I explained every feature with the kind of excitement only impossible dreams could create. Then he'd smiled. At first I thought he was proud of me. Instead he laughed. "Ethan," he'd said gently, almost kindly, "you really think investors are going to bet millions on an idea built in this apartment?" The words themselves hadn't destroyed me. It was the laughter afterward. Quiet. Embarrassed. Like he couldn't believe the man he loved could be so unrealistic. That sound had followed me longer than the breakup itself. Standing in the conference room years later, I realized something surprising. I couldn't hear that laugh anymore. All I heard was silence. Ryan slowly lowered his eyes to the company badge clipped against his jacket. For the first time since we'd met, he looked uncertain. And somehow, that hurt far more than I ever expected. The meeting ended with polite applause, the quiet shuffle of expensive shoes, and the low murmur of conversations that carefully avoided mentioning the obvious. I thanked the board members one by one, accepted a stack of reports from my assistant, and walked toward my new office without looking back. I still knew Ryan was watching me. Some habits survived even after love did not. My office occupied the entire top corner of the building, wrapped in floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked downtown Chicago. Morning sunlight reflected off the river while traffic crawled across the bridges below like tiny moving pieces on a board game. 6 years ago, I would have given anything just to work in a building like this. Back then, my office had been the corner of a cramped apartment where the heating barely worked during the winter. Every month was a puzzle of overdue bills, instant noodles, and impossible optimism. Ryan used to tease me about the way I covered every wall with sticky notes. Full of ideas. He would laugh, pull one down, kiss my forehead, and tell me that one day I would own a real office. I believed him because I believed everything he said. Until the night I did not. The memory arrived quietly, almost like an old song drifting through an open window. We had been invited to a birthday party hosted by one of Ryan's college friends. Most of the guests worked in finance or technology. They wore expensive watches and spoke confidently about promotions, investment portfolios, and vacation homes they hoped to buy before turning 30. Someone eventually asked what I did for a living. I smiled and explained my software project with more enthusiasm than experience. I talked about solving small business logistics, about making complicated systems simple enough for family-owned companies to afford. Halfway through my explanation, someone chuckled. Then another person smiled politely. Ryan placed a hand on my shoulder and laughed under his breath. He has been saying this app is going to change everything, he said. I keep telling him he should probably find a real job first. Everyone laughed. Not cruelly, not loudly, just enough to let me know they agreed. I laughed too because pretending not to be hurt felt easier than explaining why I suddenly could not breathe. That conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. It changed the next 6 years of my life. The following morning, I packed my laptop, deleted every distraction from my calendar, and promised myself that no one would ever confuse determination with fantasy again. The journey that followed had not been glamorous. There were failed investor meetings, months of rejection, sleepless nights fueled by cheap coffee, and more moments of doubt than I could count. But every closed door forced me to build something better. Every person who said no taught me how to ask a smarter question. Success had never arrived all at once. It had accumulated quietly, one difficult decision after another, until suddenly people started calling me an overnight success. A gentle knock interrupted my thoughts. My assistant stepped inside holding a digital tablet. "Mr. Carter, your department review schedule is ready. Your first meeting this afternoon is with the strategic development team." I glanced at the screen. The department manager assigned to present the quarterly report was Ryan Brooks. I looked out across the skyline once more before handing the tablet back. "Perfect," I said calmly. "Please let him know I am looking forward to our meeting." Ryan arrived exactly 3 minutes early. I noticed because he had always believed that showing up ahead of schedule was a sign of respect. Some people changed careers, cities, even entire lives, but certain habits stayed stitched into who they were. Through the glass wall outside my office, I watched him pause before the reception desk. He adjusted the cuff of his navy jacket twice, took one slow breath, and accepted a folder from my assistant with hands that looked steadier than they probably felt. "You can go in now," she said with a warm smile. Ryan nodded politely before knocking once on my open door. "Come in," I answered without looking up immediately. I let another few seconds pass while reviewing the quarterly summary on my tablet. It was not a game. I simply needed those few moments to remind myself that this was a business meeting, not a reunion 6 years overdue. When I finally raised my eyes, Ryan was standing exactly where he had stopped after entering, professional posture, hands loosely folded in front of him. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter," he said. Hearing my last name from his voice felt strangely unfamiliar. Once upon a time, he had stretched my first name into something softer, something that sounded like home. "Please," I replied calmly, gesturing toward the chair across from my desk. "Have a seat." He thanked me quietly and sat down, placing the presentation folder on the polished walnut table between us. Outside, sunlight reflected against neighboring skyscrapers, sending moving ribbons of light across the office walls. Everything looked bright, clean, and impossibly distant from the apartment where we had once argued over whose turn it was to buy groceries. Ryan opened the folder and began presenting the Strategic Development Division. His voice was composed, his numbers precise, his recommendations thoughtful. He had become an excellent manager. I listened carefully, occasionally asking questions about timelines, operating costs, and staffing projections. Each answer came immediately. Whatever else life had done to him, it had not taken away his intelligence. After nearly 30 minutes, he finished the final slide and looked up. Silence settled between us. Not uncomfortable, just unfinished. I closed the folder gently. "You have done solid work here," I said. Relief flickered across his face for only a second before disappearing behind professionalism again. "Thank you." I leaned back slightly in my chair. "I would like you to lead the integration project between the existing development teams and the new technology division." Ryan blinked. "Me? Yes." He hesitated long enough that I could almost hear every question racing through his mind. "There are more experienced directors." "Perhaps," I answered. "But experience and capability are not always the same thing." His eyes searched my face as though trying to solve a puzzle that refused to make sense. Finally, he spoke the question neither of us had acknowledged since the conference room. "Why are you trusting me?" The words hung quietly between us. I looked toward the skyline before answering. "Because this company deserves the best person for the job." He lowered his gaze. almost disappointed by the simplicity of my answer. As he gathered his papers to leave, a small photograph slipped from the inside pocket of his folder and landed face up on the floor. Before he could reach it, I picked it up. It showed Ryan standing beside an older woman in a hospital garden, both smiling despite the tiredness in their eyes. The edges of the picture were worn from being carried for a long time. Ryan accepted it carefully when I handed it back. "Thank you," he said softly. For the first time that afternoon, his carefully constructed confidence cracked just enough for me to glimpse the exhaustion beneath it. And for reasons I could not yet explain, that single photograph told me there was a story I had never been given the chance to hear. The first week of the restructuring moved faster than anyone expected. Every floor of the building seemed to hum with quiet anticipation. Departments merged, reporting lines shifted, and calendars filled with meetings that stretched from early morning until long after sunset. People smiled politely in elevators while exchanging the kind of cautious glances that only appeared when a new leader arrived. Rumors traveled even faster than official announcements. By Thursday afternoon, nearly everyone had heard some version of the story. The new chief executive officer and one of the department managers apparently knew each other. Some believed we had attended the same university. Others insisted we had worked together years ago. A few employees confidently claimed we were distant relatives. The truth remained untouched, hidden beneath layers of professional courtesy. Ryan never mentioned our past, and neither did I. During project meetings, he addressed me with complete professionalism, outlining deadlines, assigning responsibilities, and challenging technical assumptions whenever necessary. I appreciated that. He never asked for special treatment, and I never offered it. If anything, I expected more from him than anyone else on the team. That expectation became obvious during our first integration review. A proposal landed on the conference table outlining a 6-month transition schedule. Most executives nodded in agreement before I finished reading the final page. I closed the document and looked directly at Ryan. "This timeline protects the company from risk," I said, "but it also protects us from progress. We can do better." The room became quiet. Ryan studied the charts again before answering. "What timeline do you believe is realistic?" 90 days. Several executives exchanged surprised looks. One of them let out a quiet laugh before quickly clearing his throat. Ryan did not react immediately. Instead, he reached for a marker, walked to the whiteboard, and began recalculating every milestone by hand. For nearly 20 minutes, he questioned assumptions, moved deadlines, reassigned resources, and rebuilt the entire schedule in front of everyone. His sleeves were rolled neatly to his forearms by the time he stepped back. "It is possible," he admitted. "It will require every department to cooperate without delay, but it is possible." A slow smile crossed my face. "That is exactly why I chose you to lead it." Nobody spoke for a moment. Then the meeting continued as though something invisible had shifted. As people filed out afterward, I overheard fragments of whispered conversations drifting through the hallway. He challenged the chief executive officer without getting shut down. "Did you notice the way Mr. Carter actually listened to him? There has to be some history between those two." I ignored the speculation, but Ryan clearly heard it. His shoulders stiffened as he gathered his notebook. When everyone else had left, he remained standing near the conference table, staring at the skyline beyond the windows. "You know they think you are favoring me," he said quietly without turning around. I walked toward the window until we stood several feet apart, both looking over the city instead of at each other. "Do you think I am?" I asked. He answered almost immediately. "No." The certainty in his voice surprised me. "Then why does it bother you?" He let out a slow breath. "Because I spent years trying to prove I earned everything on my own. I do not want anyone believing I only matter because of someone I used to know." His words lingered long after he walked away. I remained by the glass, watching his reflection disappear down the hallway, realizing that beneath the polished confidence, the ambitious manager I had hired was still carrying burdens I had never imagined. 3 weeks into the integration project, the office had settled into a new rhythm. Deadlines that once seemed impossible were suddenly within reach. Departments that had barely spoken before were working side by side. And for the first time since the acquisition, people stopped talking about uncertainty and started talking about momentum. Ryan became the center of that momentum. He was always the first person in the building and usually the last to leave. Every morning, I found detailed progress reports waiting in my inbox before 7 o'clock. Every afternoon he walked into project meetings carrying organized notes, calm, confidence, and enough preparation to answer questions before anyone finished asking them. It reminded me of the version of him I had fallen in love with years ago, not because of romance, but because he had always believed that doing a job well was a way of respecting the people around him. One Friday evening I stayed later than usual to review financial projections. The building had grown unusually quiet. Most lights across the upper floors had already switched to energy-saving mode, leaving long reflections across the polished hallways. As I walked toward the elevator, I noticed a soft glow coming from one of the smaller conference rooms. Ryan sat alone at the table surrounded by open folders, his laptop, and several handwritten notes. He looked exhausted. His tie had been loosened, his sleeves rolled neatly above his wrists, and he was rubbing his temples while staring at a spreadsheet that clearly refused to cooperate. He did not notice me until I gently knocked on the open door. He looked up quickly and immediately straightened his posture. "I did not realize anyone else was still here," he said. "Neither did I answered with a small smile. "You should probably go home." He glanced back at the screen. "Just another hour." I looked at the document in front of him. "That estimate is off because the vendor costs are duplicated in 2 categories." He leaned closer to the monitor, following the line I pointed toward. A quiet laugh escaped him. "I have been looking at this for almost 40 minutes. Sometimes the answer only appears after someone else walks into the room." He nodded thoughtfully before correcting the formula. The total immediately adjusted. He closed his eyes for a brief second and smiled with genuine relief. "Thank you." As he gathered the papers, a prescription bottle slipped from his briefcase onto the carpet. He reached for it almost instantly, but not before I noticed the pharmacy label attached to it. The last name matched his. The medication, however, had been prescribed to someone else. An older family member. Ryan quietly placed the bottle back inside his bag without explanation. Neither of us mentioned it. We walked toward the elevators together in comfortable silence until his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, and every trace of relief disappeared from his face. His expression softened into immediate concern. "I have to take this," he said apologetically before answering. His voice became gentle in a way I had not heard for years. "Hi, Mom." "Yes, I am leaving now." "Did the doctor finish the appointment?" "No, do not worry about me. I will stop by the pharmacy before I come to the hospital." He listened quietly for several moments, reassuring her with calm patience that sounded practiced rather than forced. When the call ended, he slipped the phone into his pocket and offered an embarrassed smile. "I am sorry. You do not have to apologize," I replied. The elevator doors opened between us, but neither of us moved immediately. For the first time since we had met again, I realized that whatever burden Ryan had been carrying all these years had never really been about his career. It had been following him home every single night. Monday morning arrived with the kind of quiet confidence that only came after weeks of difficult work finally started paying off. The integration project had reached its final review stage, and every department was preparing presentations for the board. Employees walked through the hallways carrying laptops instead of uncertainty. Conversations that once revolved around layoffs now focused on new opportunities. From every measurable perspective, the company was moving in the right direction. Yet Ryan looked more exhausted than ever. During the executive briefing, he answered every question with his usual precision, but I noticed the small details everyone else missed. He had stopped drinking his coffee halfway through. He rubbed the bridge of his nose whenever he thought nobody was looking. The easy confidence that normally steadied his voice seemed buried beneath something heavier. After the meeting ended, I asked him to stay behind. The conference room emptied until only the 2 of us remained. Sunlight spilled across the long wooden table, leaving the city skyline reflected in the polished surface between us. Ryan stood quietly with his notebook tucked beneath one arm. "Is something wrong with the project?" he asked. "No," I replied. "The project is ahead of schedule." He looked genuinely confused. "Then why did you ask me to stay?" I folded my hands together before answering. "Because I have been watching you work for almost a month, and I do not think your biggest challenge is sitting inside this building." His expression changed almost instantly. The carefully practiced professionalism slipped away for just a second. "I do not know what you mean. You leave every evening for the hospital. You arrive every morning looking more tired than the day before. You carry medication that is not yours. And every time your phone rings, You look like you were preparing for bad news." Silence settled between us. Ryan stared at the floor as though searching for an answer hidden somewhere in the grain of the hardwood. Finally, he let out a slow breath. "My mother has been receiving treatment for almost a year," he admitted quietly. "Insurance covers part of it, but not everything. I have been trying to keep up with work while helping her through appointments, paperwork, and everything else." His voice remained calm, but the exhaustion beneath it no longer had anywhere to hide. "Why did you never tell anyone?" I asked gently. He gave a small, tired smile that carried no happiness at all. "Because everyone has problems. I did not want mine becoming someone else's responsibility." I remembered the young man who once believed asking for help meant admitting failure. Some things really did survive the passing of time. "Ryan," I said carefully, "being responsible does not mean carrying every burden alone." He looked up, surprised by the softness in my voice. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The years between us suddenly felt much shorter than 6. Then his phone vibrated again. He glanced at the screen and quietly excused himself before answering. I heard only a few words. "I understand. I will be there as soon as I can." When the call ended, he slipped the phone back into his pocket with trembling fingers. "I am sorry," he whispered. "I need to leave." I nodded without hesitation. "Go." He hesitated at the door before turning back. "Thank you for asking instead of assuming." After he disappeared down the hallway, I remained alone in the conference room, realizing that the story I had believed for 6 years was beginning to crack, and behind it waited a truth I had never bothered to imagine. The announcement was scheduled for Wednesday afternoon. Months of negotiations, weeks of integration, and countless hours of preparation had all led to one presentation before the board and a group of major investors. If everything went well, the company would secure a partnership large enough to guarantee growth for years to come. The atmosphere inside headquarters reflected that importance. Every conference room was occupied. Every employee seemed to move a little faster. Even the elevators felt quieter, as though the entire building understood that one afternoon could shape its future. I arrived early to review the final presentation. Ryan was already there, standing alone in the executive conference room with the lights still dimmed. His laptop was connected to the projector, and page after page of financial projections appeared across the enormous screen. He looked up when I entered and offered a small nod. "Everything is ready," he said. "Good," I replied. "Get some coffee before everyone arrives." He hesitated for a moment before answering. "There is something you should know first." His tone immediately caught my attention. Ryan walked toward the table and placed a printed packet in front of me. Several anonymous emails had been forwarded to members of the board only an hour earlier. The messages claimed that I had promoted Ryan because we had once been romantically involved. They accused both of us of hiding a personal relationship to influence company decisions. Attached were old photographs from college, including one of us laughing together at a campus festival years before either of us had imagined this future. My chest tightened, not because the photographs existed, but because someone had deliberately searched for them. "Who received these?" I asked. "Almost everyone attending today's meeting," Ryan answered quietly. "Someone wanted this released right before the partnership vote." I looked through the documents again. There was no evidence of misconduct, only carefully arranged facts designed to create suspicion where none belonged. Whoever organized it understood that doubt could be as damaging as proof. Ryan remained silent until I placed the papers back on the table. Then he took one slow breath. "I have already prepared a statement." I looked at him. "What kind of statement?" "One that says I failed to disclose our previous relationship when the restructuring began. I will resign before the meeting starts. If I remove myself from the project, the investors will have no reason to question your leadership." For a brief moment, the room became perfectly still. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, clouds drifted slowly across the Chicago skyline, completely unaware that everything inside the building had suddenly changed. "You think that is the solution?" I asked calmly. Ryan gave a tired smile that never reached his eyes. "The company comes first. It always should." I recognized that expression. 6 years earlier, he had worn the same look when he convinced himself sacrificing happiness was somehow the responsible choice. He reached into his briefcase and carefully placed a signed resignation letter beside the anonymous emails. "I never wanted my past to become your problem," he said softly. "Not then. Not now." He turned toward the conference room door before anyone else arrived. His hand had already reached the handle when I finally spoke. Ryan. He stopped but did not turn around. Do not submit that letter yet. He slowly looked back at me, uncertainty filling his face for the first time in weeks. Because this time, I said, meeting his eyes without hesitation, I am not going to let someone else decide our story for us. The boardroom filled 10 minutes later with quiet conversations, polished presentations, and the familiar confidence of people accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of employees. Investors greeted one another with practiced smiles while assistants arranged water glasses and organized thick briefing binders at every seat. The anonymous emails had clearly done exactly what their author intended. Curious glances drifted toward Ryan before quickly looking away. A few board members whispered to one another. Nobody mentioned the photographs directly, but the question lingered in the room like a storm waiting for permission to begin. Ryan remained perfectly composed. He sat beside the presentation screen with his resignation letter still tucked inside his portfolio, prepared to end his career if it protected the company. I watched him for a moment before standing to begin the meeting. The first half unfolded exactly as planned. Revenue projections exceeded expectations. Integration milestones had been completed ahead of schedule. Customer retention remained strong, and every department reported measurable improvements. By the time I reached the final slide, confidence had slowly returned to most faces around the table. Then one investor raised his hand. Before we vote, he said carefully, there is another matter we should address. The room became silent. He held up a printed copy of one of the anonymous emails. These messages suggest there may have been a previous personal relationship between you and Mr. Brooks. Is there anything the board should know? Every eye turned toward me. Ryan quietly opened his portfolio beneath the table, his fingers brushing against the resignation letter. I answered before he could move. Yes, I said calmly. There is. Several people shifted in their seats. Ryan Brooks and I knew each other years before I acquired this company. We dated when we were much younger. That part is true. The silence deepened. What is not true is the suggestion that his position, responsibilities, or performance have received any unfair advantage. I walked toward the large display behind me and replaced the final presentation slide with performance metrics prepared by the Human Resources Department. Every promotion, evaluation, project outcome, and leadership assessment had been independently documented long before I arrived. Mr. Brooks earned every assignment through measurable results. In fact, several executives recommended him for expanded leadership before I ever became Chief Executive Officer. I looked toward Ryan, who had frozen in place. If anything, I have held him to a higher standard because I knew exactly how capable he was. Murmurs spread quietly around the room as board members studied the objective data in front of them. The investor lowered the anonymous email. Then why was the relationship never disclosed? Before I could answer, Ryan slowly stood. His voice remained steady, but his eyes carried years of regret. Because I believed my past should stay in the past. I was afraid people would assume everything I accomplished came from personal history instead of professional work. That fear was my mistake, not Mr. Carter's. He paused before continuing. There is something else I should finally admit. He looked directly at me instead of the board. 6 years ago, I walked away from someone who believed in impossible dreams because I convinced myself choosing security was the responsible thing to do. I thought I was protecting both of us. Instead, I hurt someone who deserved honesty. I have regretted that decision every single day since. The boardroom disappeared around us. For a moment, there were no investors, no executives, no quarterly reports. There were only two people standing on opposite sides of a long table, finally speaking the truth they had carried in silence for far too many years. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The silence inside the boardroom no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt honest. One of the board members slowly closed the anonymous email and placed it aside as though it had finally lost whatever power it once carried. Another cleared his throat before looking toward the financial reports spread across the table. The facts are clear, he said calmly. Mr. Brooks' performance speaks for itself. I see no evidence that the company's decisions have been compromised. One by one, the remaining board members nodded in agreement. The investors returned their attention to the presentation instead of the rumors. Within minutes, the partnership proposal was approved by an overwhelming majority. Applause filled the room, Not because of the scandal that had nearly distracted everyone, but because months of hard work had finally been recognized. As people began leaving, several executives stopped to congratulate Ryan on the success of the integration project. Others thanked him for guiding their teams through one of the most demanding transitions in the company's history. The whispers that had once followed him through the hallways had disappeared, replaced by something much stronger than speculation: respect. When the last guest finally stepped out of the boardroom, only the two of us remained. The afternoon sunlight painted long golden reflections across the polished table where so many difficult conversations had taken place. Ryan picked up the resignation letter from his portfolio, looked at it quietly for a moment, then smiled to himself before tearing it neatly in half and dropping the pieces into the recycling bin. "I guess I will not be needing that anymore," he said with a soft laugh. I smiled back. "No, I do not think you ever did." He slipped both hands into his pockets and looked out across the Chicago skyline. "You know," he said after a long pause, "I spent years believing that if I worked hard enough, maybe I could forgive myself. It turns out success is not what I was missing." I stepped beside him, leaving only a comfortable distance between us. "What were you missing?" He turned toward me with the same blue eyes that had once filled me with hope, then heartbreak, and now something quieter, something steadier. "The chance to tell you I was wrong." I let those words settle before answering. "I spent 6 years believing your laughter was the end of our story. I never stopped to wonder whether it was the biggest mistake of your life instead." Ryan looked down with a faint, embarrassed smile. "It was." We both laughed softly, not because the past had suddenly become funny, but because it no longer controlled either of us. A year later, the company celebrated its strongest financial results in decades. Ryan had accepted a promotion to Chief Operating Officer after earning unanimous support from the board. Employees no longer saw him as the manager surrounded by rumors. They saw him as the leader who had helped transform the entire organization. Every Friday evening, after the offices grew quiet and the elevators carried everyone home, the two of us still found ourselves standing by the same floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Sometimes we talked about business. Sometimes we talked about Ryan's mother, whose health had steadily improved. Sometimes we simply watched the lights appear across the skyline without saying anything at all. Looking back, I realized success had never been the moment I became the person leading the company. Success was discovering that forgiveness could build a future far stronger than pride ever could. And as Ryan reached for my hand before we walked out of the office together, I understood that some dreams take years to come true because they are waiting for the people inside them to finally grow into the life they were always meant to share.